Good to see everyone this morning. Good to be here, isn't it? A little bit back to normal, if there is such a thing in our world today. Glad that you are here. And look around you. Let me see who isn't here. Give those folks a call. If you are listening in this morning, we're thankful that you can do that. One of the beautiful things about technology, when we are shut in, we're not feeling well, we can listen in. So it's a good thing, but it's even a better thing. We can come together and open our Bibles together and have the fellowship and the communion together. It's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. We're going to be studying the Book of Colossians. If you remember, that's where we were at last March. I remembered because I had written it down. I went back and searched and looked and said, okay, I finally figured that part out and said, okay, where were we? What I decided to do was basically start over. So basically we're going to look at our introduction to the book. I'll be teaching this morning and next week, and then Matthew will take over in a couple of weeks, depending on where we're at. What I will start doing is basically looking at the Book of Colossians sort of topic by topic. I don't know if Matthew will deal verse by verse or he'll have that particular approach. I guess that we'll find out. Also along that line, I know many of you have been curious and asking, Matthew and Claire have found a house up in the Evansville area somewhere, not exactly sure, but they made an offer Saturday a week ago. It was accepted, and they'll be closing about the 1st of June, somewhere about there. Up to that point, Matthew will be staying with his sister who lives down in Ottawa. Claire, I think, is still on one of her rotations. I think that maybe she'll be back in Memphis for that next rotation. But she'll be a PA, physician's assistant, I guess is what that is. She'll be finishing in December. So we're just going to see her here and there until December, but be here before we know it. So I think the Lord is with us. I know the Lord is with us. We just try to be with Him, right? Not make decisions that are counter to what He wants us to do. But everything really looks good in reference to Matthew and Claire being with us. Things seem to be falling in place, and we're very, very thankful for that. They moved a truckload of things yesterday, I think, in the storage in the Knoxville area. So keep them in your thoughts and in your minds. Okay, the Book of Colossians. You know, it's an interesting book, as all biblical books obviously are. But this particular book, written by the Apostle Paul, carries some very, very important topics that all of us need to be aware of and need to think of carefully. First, how does the book of Colossians fit into the rest of the New Testament? One of the things, anytime that we do an introduction, it's very important that we understand in our biblical study to look at the who, what, when, where, and why. And that's true with any literature, particularly with the Bible, so that we do not take something out of context, so that we do not misinterpret something. And as long as we keep in mind the background of the writing, as long as we look at the author, we look at the congregation or the city in this particular case, it always helps us to have a better understanding, a better knowledge of what the writer is about, who he's writing to, what the situation is, what the background is. So an introduction is very important. The book of Colossians is one of the prison epistles, as we call them. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And in chapter 4 of Colossians, verse 3 and verse 18 affirm that fact. Paul was in prison when he wrote this particular epistle. He was in prison in Rome. And simply by knowing that, I think it gives us a little different perspective. As he talks to this particular people, he was unable to visit them at that particular time. In fact, I don't think that we have any evidence that Paul was ever in Colossae. And that is different than most of the places that he wrote to. With the exception of Philippians, it's thought that these epistles, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon, were written basically at the same time. And some have even thought they might have been written the very same day. And one of the things that makes you think that is the similarities that were there. Colossians bears a very close relationship to Ephesians and Philemon. There was a fellow by the name of Lewis, and in his study and research, he noted that in the book of Ephesians you have 155 verses in the book of Ephesians. 78 of those basic verses, wording sometimes is a little differently, are found in Colossians. So 155 verses in Ephesians, 78 of those thoughts, or almost identical verses, are found in Colossians. So very close similarity. It's really been decided by researchers and scholars as to which epistle was written first, whether Ephesians or Colossians. They are very similar, but they're also different in ways. Colossians is somewhat abrupt, a sort of statement after statement, where the book of Ephesians has more of a flow to it. Colossians is very precise and specific, while the book of Ephesians is more lofty, general, and more spiritually uplifting. It simply indicates that Paul addressed folks differently depending on their situation, or that they were just like you and I do today, depending on who we're talking to, depending on what the circumstance of the conversation is, whether it's light and filled with jokes, or whether it's of a more serious nature. And we see that in these particular letters. The relationship to the little book of Philemon is very interesting. The church in Colossae may very well have met in Philemon's house. And Onesimus, you remember, who was the runaway slave, he was a member of this particular congregation. And one of the things that you'll notice is how much emphasis Paul gives to the relationship between slaves and masters. You see this in Colossians as well as in Philemon. In fact, he gives more attention to the relationship between slaves and their masters than he does to husbands and wives and even father and children. So again, the congregation, the makeup of the congregation, the particular problems or issues dictated what Paul really wrote to them about. The letter to Philemon again dealt with this runaway slave Onesimus, and Onesimus was returning to Philemon, and he may have returned with the one that carried the letter. Tacitus is thought likely is the one that carried the letter. So you have Paul in Rome. Somehow he meets Onesimus there. He teaches him. He is a convert, and he's been sent back to his master Philemon. And you see that written there within the book of Philemon, but it was in Colossae. And basically, as we noted, may be the church meeting in the house of Philemon. So the book of Colossians was written to the church there. Philemon was written to an individual. So two letters written maybe at the exact same time or in the same time frame, and both are being delivered to the church and likely at the very same time. The city of Colossae, it was about 100 miles or 120 miles or so from Ephesus. So basically the same location. I think they think Colossae was in somewhere in southwest Turkey today, if you're looking at a map. Some have suggested that the exact locations have never been found. Then I also read that it was discovered, but it's never been excavated. But they know basically the general area of where this particular city was located. Barclay, in his commentary, noted that the area was really known for its earthquakes. And some have thought that there may have been an earthquake that actually destroyed the city on more than one occasion. It was destroyed, rebuilt, and then maybe destroyed again. It was located on the Lashes River, and that river is a very chalky water. And that chalk made the water really good for the processing of certain dyes that they would use in clothing. And that was one of the ways that that particular town prospered. Some have believed that Colossae was the most unimportant town that the Apostle Paul ever wrote to. Of course, I guess if you lived in Colossae, you probably wouldn't think that. But when you think of the temples, in Corinth and Ephesus, and you think of the popularity in reference to the involvement of the Roman government in different areas, Colossae probably wasn't considered all that significance. 1835 is the date when some think that they discovered exactly where the town was, but again, don't know much about the city because it's a little bit debatable. Anybody with a thought on any of that type of stuff, or comment or correction? I know some of you knew what we were going to be studying, probably most of you did not. Okay, the establishment of the church is probably connected with Paul's lengthy stay in Ephesus. You remember that he was in Ephesus for approximately 2 years, and people went out from there. Paul would teach and baptize folks. Ephesus was more of a crossroads, a lot of people coming and going there. So it's likely that it was the church was established as a result of Paul's particular work in Ephesus. It is possible that Paul started the church there himself, but we really don't know that, not really any evidence to indicate that. It's more likely that it was one of his converts. But we know that Paul received a report from Epaphras, and Epaphras is the one that told Paul what was going on, and as a result of that, we have this particular letter. So Epaphras was a native of Colossae. He may have been the one that actually established the church there rather than Paul. The authorship, of course, I've been assuming all the way through this discussion that it was written by Paul. But if you look in chapter 4 and verse 18, it basically says that. Paul, by my hand or by my own hand. That has been refuted by some of more later scholars, but everything that conservative scholars have seen in reference to the comparison with the Ephesian letter and other things and the way Paul wrote, seems to be pretty conclusive. Within about 5 years after Paul's work in Asia came to an end, that's when he was in Rome in prison, and you can read that account in Acts chapter 28. So when you look at this particular letter, likely that the church in Colossae had been in existence for 5, 6, maybe 7 years at the time that Paul wrote this particular letter. Now, noted that Epaphras is the one that brought the account to Paul, telling him about the good things and also the concerning things that were taking place in Colossae. Well, in Philemon, verse 23, it says that Epaphras was a fellow prisoner. And it's interesting, I was thinking about this last night and going over some of my notes, that there were different individuals that were listed as fellow prisoners of Paul. And it makes you wonder, how that took place. Paul had his own rented house. So he was a prisoner, guarded around the clock by Roman soldiers. So how did these others come to be known as fellow prisoners? Maybe they volunteered. They volunteered to stay with Paul, to assist him in his writing and that type of thing. But they evidently, in some sense, were in prison with him. Not likely too many of us are going to volunteer to go to jail. Even if you have a good friend there. But that seems to be the situation that took place here. They supported Paul, they encouraged Paul, and even had a part in Paul's imprisonment. Now, Tacitus, as we noted, is the one that carried the letter. In Colossians chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, he's mentioned there. So he's the one that carried this letter. So Epaphras was involved with bringing Paul what was taking place in Colossae. Tacitus was involved as well. And again, from what we know, the evidence seems to indicate that Paul may have never visited the city at all. That he was doing everything through these other individuals who basically were going back and forth. Anybody with a thought there? Okay, the date of the letter, somewhere between 61 and 63. So the church, had its beginning in Jerusalem somewhere around 33 in the first century. So we're now, down the road, 30-something years and 30 years here. So Paul has continued to preach and establish congregations. This is the approximate time that Paul was in prison in Rome. The Bible seems to indicate that there were 2 imprisonments. Paul was in the Roman prison in his own hired house for a couple of years. It seems that he was discharged and then later arrested again, back in prison for about the same period of time, and then was put to death by the Roman government. During the first imprisonment, he wrote, as we've noted, Ephesians and Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Later, he wrote to Timothy and also to Titus. The approximate date of Paul's death is somewhere around 64 to 65 A.D. You may, in your research, the dates may be a little differently, read differently because some of that is just approximate in reference to when Paul was there, when he was released, when he was back in prison. Anybody with a thought or comment there? Okay, one final thing before we get into the text itself. Gnosticism was one of the false teachings that was very prominent in Colossae, and we're going to basically look at that throughout the book. Gnosticism believed that only spirit was good and flesh was evil. And one of the conclusions to that line of thinking was that it really didn't matter what you did with your fleshly body as long as your spirit was right with God. Well, that's a pretty convenient doctrine because you could pretty much do anything you wanted to do, commit pretty much any sin you could think of, and that would be fine as long as your spirit was right. Well, the Bible obviously teaches that it is the spirit being right that helps us to control the body, the spirit being the mind or the soul of man. But Gnosticism was a very popular doctrine, as you might imagine, because it allowed people to commit any kind of sin that you can think of and still feel that they were right with God in whatever way that they needed. The Gnostics believed that the aim of life basically was to release the spirit from the evil body. And this was done through secret knowledge and wisdom. So they also believed that only certain people had this wisdom or this knowledge, and thus they could control what they taught. And if you were not in the know, then you had to listen particularly to them. And I think all of us can see that there are a lot of holes in that particular type of thinking. Also, one of the conclusions of the doctrine was that they did not accept Jesus as the Son of God because he came in the form of man, thus was in the flesh. So they basically rejected Jesus, saying that God would never be found in a fleshly body. And so that's one of the main problems that Paul's going to address in this particular letter. Anything you want to add to the introduction or?
Sounds almost like they're talking about two different things at the same time, namely the Catholic Church, and I hate to say it, Freemasons, but they have a lot of secrets as well. So, keeping all these secrets and stuff that you're talking about just makes it seem like he's got a huge hump to overcome. Huge amount of misinformation to overcome here.
Yeah, I think so, and there are religions today that we can see parts of this idea in of the fact that can you study the Bible for yourself and understand it? And the Bible makes it very plain that you don't have to have an advanced degree, you don't have to have a college education to understand the Bible. There are difficult passages, but basically the Bible is easily understood. I don't have to depend on you. You don't have to depend on me. You don't have to just listen to the preacher to know what you need to do. You can study it for yourselves. So all of those ideas come out of Gnosticism and that type of thing. Now somebody else started to say something.
Well, I was going to say, most of them probably were living that way, where, they did whatever.
Yes.
So they wanted, they wanted to continue that, but they wanted to be in the church too.
Yeah. And don't you think that that's kind of philosophy in the world today? Is you don't have just enough religion to feel like that you're going to heaven someday, but basically not really accept the responsibility to be obedient to everything that actually is taught. And we see that around us everywhere, where folks want to hold on to religion, at least a little bit, to be thought that, okay, I can go to heaven when I die, and yet not really get into how we need to live each day and understand that there are things that we can't do, that the things that will not please God, and there are things that we must do in order to please God. So yes, you can see that, and I think out of what Paul says in this letter, we can look at those particular points. Anybody else?
Not everyone that says unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, there's a famous person said that too, didn't they? Yeah. That's what Jesus says, Matthew chapter 7. Not everyone that says, Lord, Lord. Yeah. So, and that was true then, it is true today. Just because we are religious doesn't mean we're right with God. Just the fact that we're here this morning doesn't mean that we're right with God. We have to make sure that our hearts are right with God. And if our hearts are right with God, then it will change our actions. It will change how we live tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day. So it is more than just assembling, as important as it is for us to be here, as important as it is for us to wear the name of Christ. We must make sure that wearing that name has changed our lives, and has changed our lives in obedience to what the Bible actually says. Anybody else?
James 4:17 teaches us that the person knows to do good and does not do it, to him is sin.
Yeah.
We cannot pick and choose what we want to believe, and certainly we just absolutely cannot overlook and just dismiss things that are plain in the Bible and black and white.
Yes.
If we do that, we're kidding ourselves when we stand before Jesus and His angels. He is going to cast us out. We must not do that.
And that's a good passage, to think about. There's several others, but James 4:17 indicates you're exactly right. And so we learn, we study for ourselves. Yes, we can help one another, but again, although our degree of maturity and our degree of knowledge may be different, yet all of us can understand it and can be obedient to it. And as you correctly point out, we don't have the right or the authority to pick and choose. And if we want to be right with God, then we need to seek to humble ourselves in obedience. So you can see why in this basically new church in Colossae that this would have been a doctrine that would have completely destroyed the purity of the church there, and would have caused these folks to definitely not be the shining lights and the examples that they needed to be if they felt that you pretty much do what you wanted to do and still be right with God. And Paul's going to deal with that. Anybody else? Okay. The first thing that I want us to think about is the preeminence of Christ. The theme of Colossians is the supremacy of Christ. Throughout the book, he is going to emphasize Christ as the head of the church. In contrast to Ephesians, the book of Ephesians puts an emphasis on the body, the church as the body of Christ, and an emphasis on the importance of people being members of that body and being faithful members of that body. Now, obviously there's a lot of overlapping, as we've noted, between the number of verses and the same type of things to talk about. But in Colossians, he is going to emphasize Christ and the supremacy of Christ being truly the head of the church. And if you look down in chapter 1 and in verse 18, and this may be, in a sense, the theme of the entire book. And he is the head of the body, talking about Christ. He's the head of the body of the church, who is the beginning the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may have the preeminence or first place. And so that is the initial thought that we want to be thinking about as we sort of get into this book. The book of Colossians also is written in very similar ways to the way that Paul did other letters. And that is the fact that he starts out by talking about the supremacy of Christ, particularly in the first 2 chapters. And then in chapters 3 and 4, he's going to talk about the submission that we give to Christ. Or to put it another way, in the first 2 chapters, he's going to talk about doctrinal issues. In the last 2 chapters, he's going to talk about a practical application. It's one thing to preach and teach, what the Bible tells us to do. It's another thing to let us know how do we do it. Here's what the Bible says. How does that apply to me practically, day to day? How does that apply to my speech? How does that apply to my actions? Well, what the Apostle Paul does is he deals with both of those. Here's the truth. Now, how do I apply that truth to my life? And truly, anytime that we're teaching God's Word, I can remember in teaching some home Bible studies. And I know that I've told you about one particular study that I did, and our song leader and we had several studies with these people, and it went real well. And we talked about the church, we talked about the one church, and we talked about all these different things. And then we got down to the end in reference to them being baptized and becoming New Testament Christians, and it dawned on them that they were going to change some things. Now, we studied maybe 5, 6 lessons together, and it never dawned on them that they were not right with God, and they needed to change their life. It did not dawn on us that they had not realized that. Well, that was the end of the study. They were not baptized, and they didn't make the changes. We failed in getting across the point that, here's what the Bible says, and here's the changes you're going to have to make. Well, I learned a valuable lesson in that Bible study that I tried not to make again. And that is the fact that, what does the Bible say? But what does that mean to me in reference to the way I live? And Paul does that so beautifully in his writings as he emphasized the truth, and then he let them know, here's what that means to you on a practical basis. Here's what it means to you in reference to how you need to alter or change your life. And in this particular book, Paul does a beautiful job in chapters 1 and 2, setting forth the supremacy of Christ, the preeminence of Christ, the first place of Christ in their lives, and then talking about what that means in reference to their accepting that and changing their lives to show respect to Him. Anybody with a thought there? Okay, what Paul's going to do is he is going to emphasize the preeminence of Christ, and Paul's going to do that with 8 different, basically, affirmations. So 8 different thoughts or statements that Paul's going to make here in reference to proving that particular point. If you look down to verse 15, we've already looked at verse 18, look at verses 15 and following. Talking about Christ. He is in the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created, that are in heaven and on earth. And notice that he's giving these individual statements to show that Christ truly is preeminent. He is the Son of God. He's in the image of God. He's the firstborn of a creation. By him were all things created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things consist. Thus he's the head of the body, the church. So what we'll do, Lord willing, next Sunday is we'll begin to break down each of these thoughts here, verses 15 through 18, to emphasize the preeminence of Jesus Christ. Again, thank you so much for being here. Invite others to be with us. It's good to be back, is it not? Thank you for your comments this morning.